free to interject. I might even just pause once in a while and say, is any of this making sense? And you can just nod to give me affirmation, even if it doesn't, and I'll feel better about myself. When I teach classes, if you're not aware, we have the Salt Lake School of Theology that's only about 2 years old now. And when I teach classes, they're 3 hours long on Thursday nights, and I only go 50 minutes break, 50 minutes break, because I know after like 45 minutes, it is hard to sit there if you're hot, to pay attention. People start drifting. So I'll probably do something similar. It's 6:25. Maybe we'll go like 40 minutes and take a break, and then one more session. Is there a time we should aim to wrap up the entire evening? Like midnight? No, I'm just kidding.
If you do a good job, you can sit.
Okay, well, I will not keep you here against your will. Yeah, I'll just... all right, well, what else do I have to say by way of introduction? This first lecture I titled, The Son Who Became Son, Hebrews 1 through 2, and the Divine Human Son of God. So if you have a Bible, you can open it to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is an amazing book of the Bible, and yet my impression is, to most people, it's one of the most mysterious and difficult. Does anyone feel that way, or do you feel like, no, I've got Hebrews down pretty good? A lot of people read Hebrews and they're like, what in the world? How in the world is he using these Old Testament texts the way he's using them? What is up with this Melchizedek guy in chapter 7? And we'll talk about that tomorrow. In fact, we live in a place, maybe the only place in the world where you can have regular evangelistic conversations about Melchizedek. Believe it or not, I've had many about evangelistic conversations about Melchizedek, and that's of course because Mormon men believe they hold the Melchizedekian priesthood. And so that's an angle on apologetics and evangelism to share the gospel with people. But we'll look at that tomorrow. Hebrews 1 is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. I think it is absolutely breathtaking, and it has a very high Christology, much to teach us about the Lord Jesus Christ. In fact, there are 4 major Christological texts in the New Testament. One of them is Hebrews 1, 1 through 4, though we could add the rest of the chapter. Does anyone know what the other 3 are? Major Christological texts in the New Testament? I bet you know it. You're probably just like, well, I don't want to say it. Colossians 1, 15 through 20. Philippians 2, 1 through 11, or 5 through 11. And John 1, 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, right? You know that text. So Hebrews 1, 1 through 4 is one of those texts. It's known as the Exordium. It introduces this epistle. And I'm not actually going to spend a ton of time in verses 1, 1 through 4, but we should at least read it and make a few comments as we jump into the content of this first discussion. So the author of Hebrews, probably writing to suffering Christians who converted from Judaism and who are tempted, because of persecution and suffering, to go back to Judaism and avoid persecution. That's likely his audience. He writes this, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. So he begins with revelation, the doctrine of revelation, not the book of Revelation, we're in Hebrews, right? But revelation. God spoke, he has been speaking, he spoke long ago at many times and in many ways, and you can think of several examples in the Old Testament of how God spoke to his people. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So the contrast is already being made. Old covenant revelation, new covenant revelation. God has spoken in these last days by his Son. And so you see right from the beginning that Jesus is the climax of God's revelation. He's God's final word. In fact, if I may be so bold to put it this way, God has nothing more to say to us because he has said everything in Christ. And that is a powerful reality. Okay? So Jesus is God's final word, and he has spoken to us in these last days. Have you ever noticed that? People always want to know, are we in the last days? Well, yeah, it's right here. We've been in the last days for the last 2,000 years. Now, people say, well, how could they be the last days? Because the last days is not so much about a length of time as it is a period of redemptive history. And we're in the last days because Christ has come and secured all of God's promises. There's no promise left to secure. Now, there are promises that we're waiting for the consummation, right? We're not in the new creation. You haven't been raised from the dead. You still suffer. Evil still exists, right? So they haven't been consummated, but there are no promises left to secure, and God has nothing left to say because he has said it in Christ. The apex of God's revelation has come, and we live in this period of redemptive history, which is why things like tonight are so important, because we're diving into the Word to understand who Jesus is. You know, how many people are so fascinated to read one of these books that come out every so often about someone who supposedly had a trip to heaven, and they've come back to tell us about it, and everyone's like, oh, that's so exciting, some new, fresh thing that we've never heard about before. And it's like, well, no. How many of those same people are interested to study Christology? You want to understand what God has revealed, press deeper into who Jesus is to understand who God is and his ways in the world. All right, so it's really a powerful opening. And the author then goes on to describe this Son. It's interesting that most of our English translations translate verse 2, but in these last days he has spoken by his Son. The Greek actually just says he has spoken en huios, by a Son. But most of the English translations supply the preposition his. And I think they're just trying to do that for the sake of clarity. But I actually think the author is saying here he has spoken to us by a Son. Now, why does it matter? I mean, it's not that significant. His, or obviously Jesus is God's Son. But a Son, I think, forces the reader to ask the question, what kind of Son is this? He has spoken in a Son, in an indefinite. And it forces us to ask the question, well, what kind of Son? Who is this Son? And in the next 7 statements, in verses 3 through 4, he makes 7 statements. He describes for us who this Son is. And what you find is he attributes things to this Son that can only be true if he is both divine and human. And I'm going to unpack that more, but just notice this. Look how he goes on. Whom he appointed the heir of all things. So I think that's humanity. How can Jesus be appointed the heir? I'm not going to answer that question right now, but just slow down and ask yourself these kinds of questions. Through whom he also created the world. So is that divine or human? Divine, right? He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. I think that's divinity, saying something about his ontology, his being. He is, as our creed states, he is God from God, light from light. Right? The Nicene Creed, true God of true God. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Human or divine? Divine, right? Providential sustainment. So that the Son is at this moment, right now, keeping all things from just going into chaos. He upholds the universe and carries human history along to its appointed end. So clearly this is a divine Son. Then look what he says. After making purification for sins, that's something he accomplishes as both the divine human Son. I don't know if we can separate it there. He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. It's an amazing statement. Having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Have you ever wondered why Hebrews 1 talks so much about angels? Anyone ever wondered that? Am I the only one? Well, I'm not going to tell you right now. I'll tell you later. But if I forget, remind me. We'll come back to that. Here's 2 questions I want to ask. When did the Son become superior to angels? So that's question number 1. When did the Son become superior to angels? And question 2, what is the name that he has inherited that is more excellent than theirs? And this will get us into kind of the meat of the discussion. So the first question is, when did the Son become superior to angels? Now, hopefully some of you are getting nervous, like, whoa, is he going off on heresy? How can anyone say, when did he become superior to angels? If he is the one through whom God created the world, then isn't he superior by virtue of his divine nature? And the answer, of course, is yes. He's the divine Son, right? He has existed from all eternity. Before angels ever existed, they're created. They are ministers. They are flames of fire. He is God. But look what the text says, right? This is why you have to read the text closely. What does it say? Having become superior to angels. Okay? So we have to ask the question why the author of Hebrews would say that. If he's divine and he's always been God and he existed and he created angels, he's always superior, then how can he talk about the Son becoming superior to angels? You see the question? Well, I think the answer begins when you understand the context. And verse 3 helps us understand the context of this chapter. Look at verse 3 again. He is the radiance of the glory of God, and the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. Now this part. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Having become as much superior to angels. So, clearly, Hebrews 1 at this point is talking about what Jesus has accomplished as the divine incarnate Son. Are you tracking with me? Let me just ask this question, just to make sure I'm being clear. When did Jesus sit down at the right hand of the majesty on high, and what does that mean? What is that referring to? What? Resurrection, right? After his resurrection, where did he go?
The right hand of majesty on high.
There you go. He ascended into the heavenly realm. So clearly the context here of Hebrews 1 is talking about what Jesus has accomplished. The fact that the logic here, the implicit logic is, the divine Son became the human Son, rose from the dead, conquered sin and death, made purification for sins, which is a reference to what? The cross, right? So after the cross, making purification for sins, he rose from the dead, he ascended into the heavenly realm, and he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, and in his enthronement, he has become superior to the angels in his humanity. This is important because it's going to help us understand chapter 2. Okay? In fact, let's just stay on this for a second to clarify. Jesus' time on earth, prior to the cross and resurrection, well, the cross included, but prior to the resurrection, is referred to as his state of humiliation. Not humiliation in the sense that, say you were walking up here to talk and you tripped and you were humiliated. I've been preaching now for 9 years and I'm still waiting for that day when I walk up to the pulpit and I just face plant. I think about it every Sunday. Which is probably why it hasn't happened yet. That would be humiliating, but that's not what we mean by his state of humiliation. In fact, one of the catechism questions, the Baptist Catechism asks, Brittany can help me out here if I can't remember the exact phrase of the question. It essentially asks, what is Christ's humiliation? And the answer is, I have it written down, it is, in his being born, and that in a low condition, made under the law, undergoing the miseries of this life, the wrath of God, and the cursed death of the cross, and being buried, and continuing under the power of death for a time. So his humiliation refers to his earthly ministry and life. When he for a while was made lower than who? Angels, right? That's what Hebrews 2:9 says. So look at Hebrews 2:9. But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus. So it's referring to his state of humiliation, right? It's talking about his earthly ministry. But now that he is risen from the dead and ascended to heaven and has been enthroned as the God-man, God the Son incarnate over the universe, and he has been enthroned over angels themselves, so that he has become superior to them, not only as he always was, as the divine Son, but now as the incarnate Son. Okay, so I just think this is incredible if you're thinking about this deeply. So the answer to the question, when did the Son become superior to angels, is when he rose from the dead and God installed him at his right hand to rule the world. All right. Question 2, what is the name that he has inherited that is more excellent than theirs? Lord? So there's good arguments for that. I don't know if I'm ultimately persuaded that that's the case, but some people do argue that it's the tetragrammaton, the 4 Hebrew letters, in English, Y, H, W, H, Yahweh. And there's good arguments for that. I'm more persuaded at this point, and I could be persuaded otherwise, that the name that he has inherited is actually Son. Several arguments for that, but look where the text goes in the very next verse. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you"? So wait, you're telling me that the eternal Son, who has always been the Son in his divine nature, he is ontologically the Son, now inherits the name Son at his enthronement. Yeah, that's weird, but I think that's what's going on. I think that's the logic here, okay? Let me put it this way. The eternal divine Son was installed as the messianic human Son at his enthronement. So I'm referring to sonship in his enthronement over the heavens as a messianic office. We could call it covenantal sonship, messianic sonship, but I think the logic here is that the Son, whom the author is talking about, is the eternal divine Son who has taken on flesh and has become the messianic Son. And I'm going to explain this. This is not the adoptionist heresy. Okay, if some of you are thinking that, oh my gosh, this guy, he's spouting heresy. No, this is not adoptionism, where Jesus was not the Son of God and then he was adopted and became the Son of God. I've tried to emphasize thus far that he has always been the Son in relation to the Father. He is eternally the Son. This is who he is. Who is the second person of the Trinity? He's the Son of God, and he has always been so. Okay? Then how does the Son become Son? Well, at his coronation in heaven, the eternal Son was appointed the Messianic Son. So let's look at this. Look where the author goes, verse 5. How am I doing on time? 6:43. What time did I start? Does anyone remember? 6:25. You guys are on it. You'll be keeping me accountable. Okay. 6:43. So verse 5. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you"? So I think a lot of people, we know as Christians that begotten here does not mean created. But this is typically how people read this kind of language. I have 6 kids, and after each kid was born, I could have held them up like Simba in The Lion King, and said, "You are my son." I only have 1 girl, so I could have done this 5 times. 5 boys, 1 girl. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Right? What is this verse referring to? Well, clearly, we're not Mormons. There was never a time when the Son of God did not exist. I said that with a double negative. The Son of God has always existed, right? So how can he be begotten today? Now, this is where some people will say, well, this must be referring to God's eternal decree. So that we refer even in our creeds to say that the Son is the one who is begotten, not made. And so that he is eternally begotten of the Father. Theologically, that's true. I don't think it's what's going on here. Okay? And the reason why, I think the author here is reading the Old Testament the way the Old Testament was intended to be read, and reading it in light of its fulfillment in Christ. So notice in verse 5, he quotes 2 Old Testament texts. The first one is Psalm 2:7. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Or again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So the first one is Psalm 2:7. The second quote, does anyone know where that comes from? 2 Samuel 7. Did I say that already? So let's start with the 2 Samuel 7 passage. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but it comes from 2 Samuel 7. This is God's covenant with David. It's a text you all should really familiarize yourselves with. It is super central and important in the storyline of Scripture. So in 2 Samuel 7, God makes these promises to David. And here's what he says. I'll just pick up in verse 12. When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And then here's the text. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So there's the promise to David, and the question we ask is, who is God talking about in this text? Who do you think? Nobody wants to answer because you look at me like I'm asking trick questions. Maybe I am.
Talking about the Messianic Son.
Yeah, the Messianic Son, which we do know as Jesus, right? But look how the text goes on in the rest of verse 14. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. And so you read that and you're like, wait, what? Clearly he's talking about Jesus, but wait, when he commits iniquity, did Jesus ever commit iniquity? No, he was tempted in every way that we are, yet without sin, right? So now what do we do with this? Well, we have to understand that when God made these promises to David, Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of the promise. But prior to Jesus bringing about the ultimate fulfillment of the promise, there are other fulfillments of the promise. So one of them would be Solomon, right? Who built a house for God's name in the Old Testament? Solomon, right? He built the temple. He also committed iniquity, right? But part of what we learn here is that when the king, the Davidic king, was installed in his office of kingship, how did he relate to God? As a son relates to his father. Okay? As a son relates to his father. What do sons do? Well, sons represent their fathers. So in the ancient world, if dad was a butcher, son was a butcher. If dad was a baker, son was a baker. If dad was a candlestick maker, what do you think his son would do? That he would be a candlestick maker. And sons would do what their fathers did, and they would represent their fathers. So, to refer to Israel's king as God's son is not a statement about that king as though that king is ontologically divine, but it says he relates to God familially. Is that a word? I may have just made that up. It's a word? Okay. He relates to God covenantally. He relates to God as a son relates to his father. You see? Why? If God is king, what would his son do? His son would be king. If God rules, how's his son to rule? With righteousness and justice and equity. So that Israel's king is representing the very rule of Yahweh. You see how that works? So with that in mind, turn to Psalm 2. Psalm 2 is the other text that Hebrews 1 quotes, and I will just turn there as well. Psalm 2, another famous text. I love Psalm 2. In fact, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 probably go together. You'll notice there's no superscription above Psalm 2, so maybe tonight do a little exercise and read Psalm 1 and see how it flows right into Psalm 2. So Psalm 2 is about the Messiah. Let's just go through it because it's small. I'll be brief. It's about a Davidic king. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? So the nations are raging against the Lord. We see that in our own day. Look where we live. Look what's happening in our own country. Right? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. So they are taking counsel against Yahweh and the Messiah. The Mashiach, in the Hebrew, right, means anointed one. Saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. They will not rule us. We will be autonomous. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, and what is he going to say in answer to these kings? As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So God's answer to the raging nations is to install his king on his holy mountain, the Messiah who will rule them all. Verse 7, I will tell of the decree. Now I think that is picking up on the Davidic covenant, in case you're wondering. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So I think what we're seeing here is that when Israel's king was installed or enthroned in their office of kingship, they would enter into this relationship with God of sonship, representative rule. Now, obviously, in the Messiah, this final messianic figure, this is one who's going to rule all the nations. This is one who's going to be installed as king and receive them as his heritage. Verse 10, now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Okay, so I think what we're seeing in 2 Samuel 7 and Psalm 2, just to summarize, is this idea that God's king, Israel's king, the anointed one, was to relate to God as king as a son relates to his father. But this is compelling because it's part of a larger biblical framework that actually begins in Genesis. So think about the creation narrative for a moment. God makes man and woman in his image, right? Now the question is, what does that mean? And, we say all kinds of things. Typically people will say, well, it means we, have certain intellectual capabilities, communication abilities. We reflect God in these kinds of ways that other animals out there don't, right? What does it mean in its ancient Near Eastern context? Well, in the ancient Near East and in the context of Genesis 1, I think image of God communicates two things: royalty And what do you think the other one is? Any guesses? Sonship. Royalty and sonship. To be made in God's image is to rule as king. So in the ancient world, when Pharaoh or kings conquered distant lands, they would put a statue in those lands of themselves to remind everyone who's the boss. Who owns this land? Pharaoh, the king. Here's his image. So God makes humanity in his image to represent his rule. This is what Genesis tells us explicitly. We should probably read it. Genesis 1. Look what it says. So Genesis 1, verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion. Subdue and dominion. That's kingly kind of tasks, right? Over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, and he goes on, I've given you plants for food. Back up to verse 26. I meant to read verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over the earth and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God makes man in his image then to rule on his behalf, his vice-regents, his servant kings, right? He creates a living statue that is to be fruitful and multiply and take dominion over the earth, so that as the image multiplies, it spreads out across the entire globe, and everyone on planet Earth knows who rules the universe. It is Yahweh. Look at his image, covering the earth as the waters cover the sea. Right? So that's how the narrative begins. But another part of this image language, which you see from Genesis 5, which I won't read, but you can go read it, is that image refers to sonship. So if I were to ask you this multiple choice question, get nervous when there's tests, right? Who's the Son of God in the Bible? Adam? Israel? David? Jesus? Or always look for E, all of the above. Which one would you pick? E. Yeah, you're tracking with me, right? Did you know Luke 3, the genealogy of Jesus, ends with Adam, and how does it refer to Adam in that genealogy? Adam, the son of God. Why was he the son of God? Because he was made in his image. Exodus 4:20, what does God say of Israel? Israel is my firstborn son. What does God say of the Messiah? He shall be to me a son, and I shall be to him a father. You see a pattern here? In other words, Adam, as the first man who's created, is to bear the image of God, to represent his rule, and to show the whole world what Yahweh is like. And then as the narrative continues, Israel inherits that role. They are to relate to God as a royal priesthood. As sons relate to their father and show the whole world what living with Yahweh is like, what worshiping Yahweh is like. And then when they receive a king, the king is to rule with justice and righteousness and equity to show the whole world what? What Yahweh is like. So to bear the image of God is to relate to God as his son, to rule the earth, to establish his kingdom so that his glory fills the earth. That's what's going on in these narratives. Okay? This is why Mormonism doesn't understand the Bible. Let's just make an application to our current context. Because it is too simplistic and divorced from the narrative storyline of Scripture. Oh, begotten language? That means Jesus was born of parents. Well, no, sonship is actually used in different ways in the Bible. One of them is his eternal divine nature, but sonship is also used to refer to these covenantal figures. You see that? They're patterns. So we come to Hebrews, and it makes perfect sense. You can put it all together now, right? Hebrews 2:5 is not about the virgin birth. What is it about? When, let me answer the question this way, did God declare to the Son, in fulfillment of Psalm 2, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you"? According to Hebrews 1. What's the context? Just trying to see if you're tracking with me. Pressing you a little bit.
Is that his baptism?
Well, he does say it at his baptism, and I'll address that. This is my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. It says it at the Transfiguration. But specifically, Hebrews 1, what is the time frame? The exaltation. When you read Hebrews 1, it is about enthronement in heaven. In fact, Hebrews 1:3 and Hebrews 1:13 form an inclusio. It's bookends of the chapter, and both refer to Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And Psalm 110 is fulfilled in Jesus' heavenly ascension and enthronement over the cosmos, so that what's happening in Hebrews 1, "You are my Son, today I've begotten you," to which of the angels did he ever say that? None of them. Why? Because no angel was made in the image of God. No angel has been installed as the Messianic Son over the cosmos as a human figure. Do you see the logic here? Hebrews 1 is not about the virgin birth. It is not a Christmas text. It is an Easter text. Because what God intended for humanity to take dominion over the earth and to reign as his image bearers has been fulfilled in the perfect expression of the image of God in man, which is Christ, who has conquered sin and death, who has conquered Satan, who has perfectly obeyed the Father, who has risen from the dead, and who has taken the highest seat in the cosmos to rule the world, of which no angel could ever occupy, because angels don't bear the image of God. Now there's more to this, but is this making sense? I hope this is reframing the way you read Hebrews. Where should we go from here? Notice verse 6, that the Son is the object of the angels' worship. So this theme continues. Keep reading with this context in mind. Why am I in Ezekiel? Flip to Hebrews. Here we go. In the wrong book. Hebrews 1:6. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." So let's start with firstborn. Once again, it is not biblical to read firstborn as first created being. If that was the case, we get a lot of confusion, because did you know there's multiple firstborns in the Bible? I've already said Israel. Israel is my firstborn. Psalm 89, speaking of the Davidic Messiah. Let me read to you verses, do I have it in my notes? I think I'll just have to turn there. Psalm 89, I'll actually read it to you. I'll read you verses 20 through 28. This is speaking of David, the new David. Psalm 89, verse 20. "I have found David my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him," the Messiah, "so that he shall be established with him. My army also shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him. The wicked shall not humble him. I will crush his foes before him and strike down those who hate him. My faithfulness and my steadfast love shall be with him. And in my name shall his horn be exalted. I will set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers." Worldwide dominion, right? Sea and rivers. He's going to rule the world. "He shall cry to me, 'You are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation.'" He's going to relate to God as a son relates to his father. "And I will make him the firstborn," the prototokon in the Greek. Isn't that a fun word just to say? Prototokon. Sounds like a transformer or something. The prototokon, the firstborn. "The highest of the kings of the earth." So what does firstborn refer to, just in context there in the parallel verse? Supremacy, preeminence, not created order. The highest of the kings of the earth, the firstborn is the supreme one, the preeminent one, the one who receives the inheritance. My steadfast love I will keep for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him. So, the firstborn of Israel, they're the preeminent, they're God's son, they're the one who receives the inheritance, the Davidic king, the preeminent one, supreme. Now, referring to Jesus in Hebrews 1 as the Davidic son, when he brings the firstborn into the world. Now, again, this is not a Christmas text, right? We shouldn't be thinking, hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn king. When he brings the firstborn into the oikumene in the Greek, which can refer to an inhabited realm, he says, let all the angels worship him. Now, what is the oikumene, the inhabited realm? Well, the same word appears in Hebrews 2:5. So look at Hebrews 2:5. I don't know why I keep turning pages in my Bible to random books. Hebrews 2:5 says, now it was not to angels that God subjected the world, the oikumene, to come, of which we are speaking. So the world to come, he did not subject the world to come to angels. So this is a future world that he has been speaking about. And what is the world that he has been speaking about in chapter 1? It is the heavenly realm over which Christ presently reigns. So you go back to verse 6, I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. And again, when he brings the firstborn, the risen Messiah, the first man of the new creation, the preeminent, supreme God the Son incarnate, into the heavenly realm, he summons those who dwell there, which are who? The angels, to worship him. Now, wasn't the Son always the object of the angels' worship as God? Yes. But he has achieved now something in his human state, so that as a man, the God-man, he becomes the recipient of the angels' worship and rules over them and the eschatological world that will one day come from heaven to earth. What do I want to say here? Let me just pause and see if there's comments or questions. Do any of you think I'm crazy? Hopefully this is at least persuasive, even if you're not convinced. Zach?
So I'm going way back
Yep.
to when you're talking about the title being son.
Yep.
How should we take that and then apply that to other portions of the New Testament that say things like Jesus has the name above all names?
I think so.
And that name in all of those.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to say in everyone, because like in Philippians 2, the name that he inherited, I think, is a quote from Isaiah, and I think it's Yahweh, and that's one of the reasons people will appeal to this text and say it's the same thing. But there are places in the New Testament where Son refers to his divine nature. You know, he is the only begotten Son, the monogenes in John's Gospel. And I think that's referring to his divinity. And then there's other places where I think sonship is referring to his messianic office. So it's a good question.
Does it have to do with the work that he does?
Does what have to do?
Those two titles have to do with the work that he does in those particular instances.
The context? Yeah, I think
The Son.
I think context is king, and it just depends on what the author is addressing in that particular context. But I think what's happening in Hebrews 1 is he's reading these Old Testament texts in light of the biblical storyline. So that he's not just pulling out proof texts, but he's showing how these promises are part of this great narrative that find their fulfillment in Christ. Because look at how the verses continue. Verse 7, of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. So angels are God's servants, right? They're winds and flames of fire. They're incorporeal here, as he's saying. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Do you know where that comes from? That's Psalm 45. Just think about this for a minute. Isn't it amazing that the author of Hebrews is preaching this incredible sermon about Jesus by quoting all these Old Testament texts? But what happens when you go back and read Psalm 45? Maybe we should do that. Because what happens is you get confused. At least I do. Okay, so listen again what he says in Hebrews. Angels, your winds and flames of fire, but of the Son, quoting Psalm 45, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. So of the Son, he refers to him as God, but of angels, their winds and ministers and flames of fire. Okay, so then we go back and look at Psalm 45, which is this kind of a marriage psalm about the Davidic king. My heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. So this is Israel's king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the most handsome of the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your majesty ride out victoriously for the cause of truth, meekness, and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you awesome deeds. Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies. The peoples fall under you. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. You see how this is confusing? I mean, he's clearly talking about Israel's king, and then he calls him God. And you say, well, he's just, somebody would say, predicting the future that the Son would be, divine. And it's like, well, no, I don't think that's exactly what's going on. Was he attributing deity to Israel's king? Oh, that would be kind of heretical, right? And so, well, this just has to be a prophecy, a direct prophecy of Jesus. But that's problematic because look what he goes on to say. He's talking about his marriage. In verse 13, all glorious is the princess in her chamber with robes interwoven with gold and many-colored robes she is led to the king. With her virgin companions following behind her with joy and gladness, they are led along as they enter the palace of the king. In the place of your fathers shall be your sons. You will make them princes in all the earth. He's going to have children. I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore, nations will praise you forever and ever. So he's getting married. He's going to have children. And he says, your throne, oh God. Again, what do we do with this? Well, I think if we understand this whole idea of what I've been talking about, that the king of Israel's role and kingship was so closely associated with the divine rule of Yahweh, to speak of the king as Elohim is to speak of the king as God's representative, representing his righteous rule. That's what's happening in Psalm 45's context. Now, when you apply it to Jesus, you still get that typological connection, but of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, but it's also heightened because of what he's shown us in this first chapter, which he is indeed divine. This is why it's so helpful to speak of Jesus as God the Son incarnate, because it captures both of those realities. There's kind of two streams of Christology in the New Testament. You have his divine, if I had a whiteboard I would write it up here, so just visualize it. Think of a valley. So at the top of the valley on this side is the eternal divine Son. And then he becomes incarnate. You go down in the valley, his state of humiliation in his humanity. He dies on a cross. He rises from the dead, ascends the other side of the valley, and continues forward now as the divine human Son, so that he is achieved and worthy of glory doubly, both in his eternal divine nature and by virtue of what he has accomplished in his humanity. And I think that's what's going on in Hebrews, and how we make sense of these texts that the author is quoting from the Old Testament, which were clearly in some instances, about human figures. Comments or questions? I'll finish out this chapter, but anything you want to ask? I'm not really following my notes, so I'm seeing what else I have to say in here. $7:14. Go ahead.
A really good question or not, but I was just thinking about having this conversation with a particular LDS friend of mine, and I was just thinking about how both sides, we really focus on God is the same yesterday, today, and
Forever. Yep.
And so I'm just like picturing having this conversation with her, and then saying like, well, how is God the same?
Yep.
If, like,
Yeah, his eternal, that's an excellent question. God's eternal nature does not change through the incarnation. God is immutable, he is unchanging. The Son is God, right? Now, in Jesus' human nature, he grows, he learns, he obtains favor before men and God. But God is immutable, so the Son in his eternal nature never changes. And that is important to reaffirm. And that's an excellent theological question where theologians have tried to thread theological needles. The one person of the Son works through both the divine nature and the human nature. And in his divinity, he never changes. There's some mystery there, some difficulty there. It's a good question. So look how the chapter continues, and we'll just wrap up because I've been going 50 minutes, and I said 50 minutes break, 50 minutes break. Now, verse 10, quoting another psalm, I won't spend time here, but talking about, again, how he doesn't change. He's applying now a text that refers to the Lord Yahweh and his creative power to the Son, because he's the divine Son. You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning. The heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. This is the Son of God. And to which of the angels has he ever said, here's Psalm 110, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? Hebrews 1 is an incredible text. It assumes resurrection. The context is after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And it refers to his installment and enthronement as the human Messiah who has been exalted over even angels and become the object of worship for all. Angels in the Old Covenant were mediators of that divine revelation. In these last days, God has spoken in a Son. This Son is the truest expression of the image of God in man. He is eternally divine. He has made for your purification for sins. He has taken his seat on the highest throne in the universe. Why would you go back to Judaism? It is an incredible argument. Comments or questions, then we'll take a break and get a drink and stretch. Okay, so we'll resume, in like 6 minutes? Since we started late? Okay, so like 7:23, and then I'll try to wrap up by 8. All right, I'm going to get a water too.
Like Christ, well, by the way, I'm Randy.
Hey, Randy, yes.
I'm Matthew and Christopher.